Our series, Conservation Histories and Hope, examines backgrounds of specific conservation challenges, looks at how changing perspectives, technologies, and methods, or new or newly embraced knowledges are broadening or challenging how we understand conservation and how we talk about conservation and how we do conservation. So, what is different now? What gives us hope for the future of biodiversity outcomes in all of this new opportunity? Our speaker today has investigated the environmental, social, political, cultural, geographic, and conservation histories of wild cats surviving at the fringe of their populations in the liminal and contested US-Mexico Frontera. She's dedicated her efforts to the study of conservation and restoration of the native cats in the borderlands, including the jaguar, jaguarundi, and ocelot. She leads Defenders of Wildlife's ocelot conservation program in the Texas Rio Grande Valley. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sharon Wilcox today to launch this year's Conservation Speaker Series. Dr. Wilcox serves as the Senior Texas Representative for the environmental nonprofit Defenders of Wildlife. She's an Associate Professor of Practice in Geography and Sustainability at the University of Texas San Antonio. She also serves on the Board of Directors for Friends of Laguna Atacosa National Wildlife Refuge in Rio Hondo, Texas. She's the co-editor of the book Historical Animal Geographies. She's authored scholarly articles and book chapters examining contemporary and historical interactions of borderlands humans and wild cats. Her work has been featured in The Washington Post, The Guardian, National Geographic, Smithsonian Magazine, and Texas Public Radio. Her research has received support from National Endowment for the Humanities, the Social Science Research Council, and the Smithsonian Institute. Welcome, Sharon, and thank you for being here.
I'd like to start by thanking the IIC. This is an incredible opportunity. One thing I did not include in my bio is that I am from Virginia. And I went to college about an hour and a half down the road at Mary Washington. And so while I started my journey here in Virginia, it has taken me to Texas and into the borderlands, New Mexico, Mexico, and Arizona as well. This is my favorite topic to talk about, obviously. It is what I have spent most of my career looking into. And when I started this work nearly 20 years ago, one of the biggest gaps was in public awareness that these cats even persist on the landscape. And so this is such a wonderful opportunity to reach outside the region and broaden the audiences that we're able to reach with this message. And along with that comes, renewed interest and renewed support for these cats. All right. So these are our cats of the borderlands. We have the ocelot, jaguar, jaguarundi, mountain lion, and bobcat. Now, the bobcat and the mountain lion persist throughout much of the US-Mexico borderlands on the US side of the boundary. I should clarify that I am mostly talking about the region north of the political border today, so the cats in the United States and subject to US law and policy. This fellow is secretly all of our favorites. This is the jaguarundi. They are a funny little cat. They kind of look like an otter. They are comical. They kind of hop around. Unfortunately, the jaguarundi is extirpated. It is extinct in the United States. We do have, I think our final jaguarundi record in Texas is from the mid-1980s. And there's some debate on if that cat was a pet or a wild animal on the landscape. So if you Google jaguarundi in Texas, you will find endless articles with people hopefully speculating that maybe these cats are persisting on on different ranches. I will say that despite extensive monitoring, we do not yet have any records of the cats at current time in Texas. Now these two guys at the top, these are who I'm focusing on today. We have the ocelot. Ocelots do persist in Texas. We have a breeding population. We're going to talk about that a lot more. And then jaguars, who we find in remote corners of Arizona and occasionally New Mexico. And they also persist on the landscape. In fact, we had a new sighting, 2 new sightings reported last night. So cutting edge information. I don't even have images to share yet from those guys. Despite the scale of these 2 photos, these cats are in no way the same size. An ocelot is a medium-sized wild cat, kind of the size of a large house cat. A jaguar is a big cat. These guys are the largest cat in the Western Hemisphere. They weigh over 100 pounds, and they have incredibly strong jowls. They have one of the strongest bite forces of any mammal on the planet. So much bigger guy, much more muscular build you can see on the right-hand side, and these cats again are medium cats that weigh about 20 pounds. All right, so here we have 2 maps, our jaguar and ocelot distribution. The jaguar you can see here, we have light green for the historic distribution, dark green for current. This map at the very tip there, it's kind of pushing the top of the screen, but that range technically ends right there at the border. But again, we're going to talk about how these cats are crossing that border. And you can see we have had range-wide contraction and where these cats were found a couple of 100 years ago versus today. Ocelots have a very, very similar range. They use a lot of the same landscapes and corridors as jaguars. We don't have a historical range on the ocelot map, but it is virtually the same as the jaguar. And you will see here, we do have ocelots that persist up to the tip of Texas, and then also heading up toward Arizona. I'll talk about that more later as well. So a very important aspect of restoration ecology as it is governed in the United States is establishing historical range. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as state agencies, really rely on historical record establishing the presence of animals in order to justify programs to either protect or restore populations. And so in our work and environmental history, we are able to help start to re-establish or better document. Let me back up a hair. A big part of this talk today is I want to emphasize the way in which restoration ecology and the way in which we go about endangered species conservation today is not founded only in biology or ecology, but rather it's really a multidisciplinary approach that's informed by work in social science and the humanities as well as the sciences. And I should share with you that I am not a biologist. I am a cultural geographer and an environmental historian. You may have noticed the sources of my funding are a little unusual, right? The National Endowment for the Humanities, that's not biology. My Smithsonian money came from the library. So instead what we're seeing is this multidisciplinary, this interdisciplinary approach to conservation. So here, as we work to reestablish in our own records where these animals once persisted, we have to go to some predictable as well as maybe less predictable resources. A common place we'll go is into the historical record of folks who were looking at the landscape and observing. Now I want to point out, a lot of this is rooted in settler colonialism because a lot of the history of human relationships with and observations of animals on the landscape prior to the arrival of colonialist presence has been erased. And so when we comb back through the record, we're going to documentary evidence we can find and interweaving that with other resources as well that I'll reach here in a moment. So here, this is Aldo Leopold's records. He worked a lot in the Colorado River Delta. And so through his records, we're able to capture his observations on the landscape in the early 20th century. But also, he had a number of people writing to him, sharing their own observations. And so it's actually a much richer set of observational data than you might expect. Now, interwoven, I should also point out, I note here that we're documenting tigers and leopards of the past. The names jaguar and ocelot are actually pretty modern names. Both of those terms are actually rooted in indigenous names for these cats. When settler colonialists were arriving, they were using Eastern Hemisphere terms to describe Western Hemisphere animals. And this persisted from contact through the mid-20th century. And so jaguars were tigers and ocelots were leopards. We often still will see ocelots called Mexican leopards. And so again, it's only in recent time that we see this more modern terminology. And so I spent a lot of time searching for other terminologies that I think people might have been using to describe what they were seeing. It can be really tricky too to discern what cat they were seeing because of course they're both spotted. And human memory is notoriously slightly faulty, especially when you're experiencing a sort of a hyper-real event of seeing a fleeting moment of a wild cat. You may not have perfect recall on the size and the shape of that cat. And so what we end up with are little glimpses in the text of these animals that we're trying to discern, peering through the text. What are we looking at? Now, a more reliable record is the material record. Often through the major museums like the Smithsonian, the Natural History Museums in Chicago and New York, we have a long record of animal bodies, material bodies and remains. And so we have both taxidermy and skins. And the acquisition data on this material matter is really important, again, for reconstructing some of this range history. This cat is from northern Mexico. There's quite a bit written about him. He is on display in New York. And then, so interesting, when you go behind the scenes at like the Smithsonian, they'll just pull open drawers of these furs and pelts. Some of them are coming from former zoo animals, but some are storied pelts that go back hundreds of years and have been passed to the museums. And again, that acquisition material attached to those furs can be really interesting. We also have more appearances of leopards and tigers in material culture in objects that people were wearing or decorating their homes with. I spend way too much time like Googling Civil War era, Mexican War era soldiers because for Texas soldiers in particular, we would find them wearing leopard vests. This is Sam Houston at the top. That's his leopard vest in the middle. That is a very storied vest in Texas. It is on display at the Sam Houston Museum. And he wore that everywhere. He was very proud of it. When we look at that, that is a jaguar. That is not a leopard. And we can tell because jaguars have very open rosettes in their fur with little spots. And they are the only spotted cat that has that particular pattern. But here we have a man wearing a jaguar fur bolero, like a little jacket. And on the other side, I believe both of them are wearing jaguar chaps. So again, this material culture, these furs are being sourced from somewhere. And there's a reason we only see Texas soldiers wearing them in the mid-19th century. And finally, the source material we like the most for reconstructing historical range, of course, is photographic evidence. So we actually rank our sighting data by reliability. So a photograph, a confirmed photograph, or a sighting by an expert would be considered a class 1 or most reliable sighting. And then we go down to tier 2 and tier 3 from there, just based on the reliability of the resource and how much we can have faith in the reported acquisition data or other, sighting data attached. So here we see the last jaguars in Texas and Arizona. So in 1948, this is Kingsville, Texas, and I apologize, these photos are difficult to look at. Unfortunately, when jaguars encountered humans, when we know of moments of encounter, they always ended in the death of the jaguar and almost always in the death of an ocelot. So here, these cats were very much viewed as aggressive predators, right? And so we have this long history in the United States of settler colonialists coming in and removing predators from the landscape. And jaguars were absolutely included in that ethic of removal. This idea that land was best managed for livestock, for human enterprise by the removal of all predators. Jaguars were big, they were fierce. They were found in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and so when they were encountered, they were killed. What's stunning is how late this is happening. 1948, Kingsville, Texas. 2 years before that, we had one killed in Central Texas. We find this evidence in local newspapers. And even into the 1960s, we have the last female jaguar killed in Grand Canyon. And just a year later, another male jaguar, the last on the record for central Arizona, was killed. And so at the mid-20th century, we believed that jaguars were extirpated. We did not have any additional sightings after that point reported in Arizona or Texas. And so we're able to build these maps with this sighting data. This is, I believe, jaguarinfo.org. So there are data points here. There are also polygons. The polygons don't pop the same way on this map. But this is an interactive map that you can visit, and you can pull up all of the data we have in terms of what we're basing this sighting on. It might be imagery. Again, it might be a narrative that's recorded in an archive or in a natural history resource. And this map is built from records from the 19th and 20th centuries. Again, reflecting that settler colonialist history and not revealing a much deeper human relationship on this land that sits beneath. Here in Texas, you'll see in San Antonio, we've got a polygon around the city of San Antonio. There were multiple jaguars sighted in that region. And one killed in the 1940s is that little polygon west of Austin. So again, they really persist throughout the Southwest. Now, most of New Mexico does not have jaguars, and that is because it has to do with the character of the desert. So this swath of desert moving up from Sonora into Arizona was a much more verdant desert. That's the Sonoran Desert, and it supports jaguars well. There's plenty of prey, there's enough available water, and plenty of space for these jaguars to roam. So they used that corridor throughout history until until settler colonialist presence. But again, that explains sort of that gap there in Chihuahua and New Mexico, is the desert is too arid. And then when we get further east in Texas, we're again in a more verdant landscape in Tamaulipas and into Texas. So both cats persist there. So by the mid-20th century, we have people like Ernest Thompson Seton, who worked in New Mexico and Arizona, recognizing the plight of the jaguar and speaking to the public about what was to come. So he called it man, the implacable enemy of the jaguar. And in this image, the jaguar is leaving the desolation of Arizona and moving back, maybe to the verdant fields of Mexico, or maybe this jaguar is leaving desolation on Earth and moving to another realm. Similarly, Aldo Leopold, who worked in the same region 20 years later, noted that the landscape had really lost something with the loss of El Tigre, the tiger. And so by the time the river delta was probably made safe for cows, but was forever dull for adventuring hunters, freedom from fear had arrived, but a glory had departed the green lagoons. So there was sort of a romanticizing of these cats, but also, again, recognizing that they were gone. So we're going to leave the jaguars there in the mid-20th century, and we're going to shift eastward and look at ocelots, because this is where the ocelot and jaguar story starts to split off a little bit. So jaguars, again, are bigger, more fierce cats, or at least they have a more fierce presence. And so they really experienced the stress of predator removal. At the same time, there were also probably fewer jaguars. These are big cats who have enormous ranges of over 100 miles. Males do not like to overlap ranges except in very special circumstances. And so we think the jaguar population in Arizona and New Mexico was always not the most dense. We would find that more further down into Central America. Now, ocelots are very different. They're much smaller, and they do not present the same challenge to cattle ranching, which was also taking over in Texas. They're also rather compelling, and unfortunately for them, if you grab them out of the wild when they're young, they are somewhat tameable. I'll explain why I say unfortunately later. So ocelots were sort of reimagined in Texas as pets and trophies as well as pests. So they were not viewed with the same hostility, but again, when these cats would encounter humans, it didn't go well for them. They were not released back into the wild. Typically, they were either killed and possibly stuffed or made into a garment, or they became pets. And that's why it's so unfortunate that they are tameable. What again is so astounding is how late this record documents these cats throughout the state. We have Amarillo Daily News reporting a cat killed with actually a decent image. It's difficult to see here, so we outlined the cat. Amarillo is in the northern panhandle of Texas. That is quite a far away. That's a 12-hour drive from where we find them now. Waco, which is central Texas, we have a cat killed there in 1959. And then further in the Rio Grande Valley, that southernmost tip of Texas, we have a really robust record of these cats, which doesn't surprise us because that's where we find them today. Here, this is Laguna Atascosa. Laguna Atascosa was once, before it was a national wildlife refuge, it was a military training facility. And so we have an interesting record of soldiers handling these cats. So they were able to trap them, catch them, and then handle them. So that cat is actually on a chain, and we have a number of soldiers in this photo series posing with the cat. That is a juvenile ocelot, but they don't get much bigger than that. And again, we also find these cats written into the record in the local news. This particular story was a person in the 1940s struck a cat with their car, did not kill them, but unfortunately for the cat, it ended up with the cat, this is the most Texas thing ever. He then lassoed the leopard and carried him to Los Fresnos, where the cat was then on display. So these intersections with these white settlers did not end well for these cats. Interestingly, we're able to build sighting data maps as well. This one is more for public consumption, so we've got like a fun little icon. Dark orange are jaguar records, yellow are ocelot, and you can see, of course, a clustering down there in South Texas. But again, what's also stunning is their range throughout the state. And again, by mid-20th century, we're seeing a significant retraction in that range. Now, a couple things happen in the mid-20th century that really impact ocelot populations further throughout their range. First is the popularity of fur coats. It takes about 12 ocelots to make a coat like this. This coat would be worth like $100,000, I believe. It's a very expensive coat. But they were very popular, and it was a significant way of expressing wealth in certain populations in the United States, and so an ocelot coat was considered one of the best ones you could purchase. At the same time, National Geographic wasn't doing us any favors. This comes from a guide to wildlife published by National Geographic in the mid-20th century, calling the Texas ocelot an overgrown tabby in fancy dress. And then this entry goes on to call them to note that they're a friendly pet even in an apartment. Thanks. And then finally, you may know Babu. Babu kind of had a resurgence in popular culture a few years ago because of the cartoon Archer. If you're familiar with that cartoon that's on FX, the main character is obsessed with big cats, and there is a ocelot on that animated show named Babu. He is named for this Babu. This is Salvador Dali's cat, who did the scene with him in New York City and abroad in the 1960s. So again, this is the messaging people are getting about ocelots. And unsurprisingly, the populations were deeply impacted by cats being removed for the wild and either killed for their coats or taken up into the pet industry. Now, both of these are still very much direct pressure on the populations by humans, right? People are seeking out ocelots and killing them or trapping them for human entertainment and adornment. And I will also say at the same time, the cats were still also considered pests, and on certain ranches, they would be killed if they were found or hunted because they made a good trophy. They could be, turned into taxidermy. Today is a very different story. A lot of the pressures, a lot of the interest in ocelots has changed. We don't see fur coats out there in popularity anymore. And pet keeping has also diminished significantly because of CITES, which is a series of international laws now that protect endangered wild animals from the trafficking in live animals and their body parts, including their pelts. So international law has had a lot of positive impact for these cats. And again, also just popular trends have moved away from utilizing ocelots for entertainment and adornment. So here is where our breeding population is today. And again, you can see that historic range. And today we have a contraction. In Texas, we have 60 to 100 ocelots. 15 to 20 of them are at Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge. All of the rest live on private ranch lands. They actually live on some of the largest and most famous ranches in the country, which turns out to be really advantageous. It was a stroke of luck for them. We'll talk about that later. You can see there's a gap here of about 100 miles down into Mexico, and then we have a robust population in Tamaulipas, Mexico. That 100-mile gap is filled in with agricultural land. Oh, and an obvious political border that I will talk about. So here's how we view these cats today. These are nocturnal or cats, so we get them on night vision on cameras. They're most active at night. This is a cat at Laguna Atascosa. He is not in a cage. That fencing behind him is to keep feral hogs out of the structure right here. That is what we call a bubbler or a water fountain for wildlife. That can actually be fairly controversial in some restoration ecology circles. We do basically have water fountains for wildlife across Laguna Atascosa, and it's because of climate change. We are seeing significant differences in precipitation at the refuge. We are seeing salinization of fresh water. And so in order to support ocelots as well as many other species that are present at this refuge, we have to provide, or we have to supplement their freshwater sources. So these bubblers are installed and then surrounded with hog fencing because we have feral wild hogs that will tear up anything that is on the landscape. And the fence works really well. It's about 3 feet high. The cats jump over it, or they squeeze right through the squares, because cats can do that. He's also wearing some monitoring equipment. Oh, and the ocelot is considered fully endangered in the United States and enjoys full protection under the Endangered Species Act and has since its establishment in the 1970s. So today, when we think about ocelot conservation and the future of ocelots in Texas, we're really thinking about indirect pressure on these cats. Today, people aren't really seeking these cats out and killing them. Rather, it's about habitat destruction. That is the single greatest challenge to conservation and restoration of ocelots. This is the Tamaulipan thorn scrub, or we prefer to call it the thorn forest. In Texas, ocelots are habitat specialists. They reside in exactly one kind of habitat, and this is it. Now, that's just in Texas and parts of Tamaulipas, Mexico. You get to other parts of their range. You'll remember these cats are really wide-ranging. They occupy different habitats, but the commonality is the density of the brush. They really like dense, thick brush. And so this thorn forest is very aptly named. It is an arms race in there. Every single plant in there has a thorn on it. I sacrifice an entire wardrobe of field clothing to these thorns. Every semester it just tears holes in your clothing. But this is ideal for ocelots. Remember, they're not very big, and this gives them excellent protection for and it provides great ground for hunting and raising their young. Ocelots share these landscapes with coyotes, and coyotes will kill ocelots, particularly young ocelots. So again, that protection is really important. And again, also remember, ocelots are small cats, and they're opportunistic hunters, and so the lizards and birds and other small mammals that they share this landscape with are an excellent prey base. And so they are the apex predator in the thorn forest. Unfortunately, only 10% of the thorn forest remains. So today, the Rio Grande Valley, we see a lot of pressure on the habitat. Historically, that has been agriculture. The Rio Grande Valley is one of the breadbaskets of America. Many of your fruits and vegetables are coming from this region. That the Rio Grande just sort of snakes through this landscape. There are oxbow lakes everywhere. This meandering river has created this incredibly rich soil. And so over the last 100 years, so much of the soil has been turned over into agricultural land. Historically, this was our big concern, but this is our concern now. In the last 10 years, the population in the Rio Grande Valley has skyrocketed. It went from a sleepy little region to a growing metropolis. And with growing population comes development. And here we're not seeing urban infill and the growing up of cities, rather we are seeing suburban sprawl. And so we are losing so much remaining land now to this. There are a couple aspects of this landscape that are really dangerous for ocelots. First of all, the loss of habitat. The second of all is, of course, loss of connectivity. We have patches of habitat, but they're not connected to each other. So the cats can't safely move between patches of habitat. So we have real constraints on how many cats can be at a spot and how genetic material is able to flow in the population. So for instance, our Laguna Atascosa cats are completely separated from the ranchland cats, even though they're only 10 miles away. Those 10 miles look like this. Finally, a very important aspect in development, or in the development of this landscape, are roads. So roads are serious impediments to ocelot survival on the landscape. I'll talk about that more in a minute. I have a slide coming up. But here, this is giving us that sense of that human development heat map, that footprint. And again, this valley region right along the border is only growing. Since 2020, it has really taken off, which we were not predicting. And it has a number of conservation programs scrambling in ways we were not even before, because we realize we are under the gun to identifying remaining patches of thorn forest and identify spots that could be restored, have the right soil type, and tagging or identifying those lands either for acquisition or for a conservation agreement if we are able to negotiate such an agreement at this point. The problem is what was once sleepy ranch land is now worth a lot of money for development. So it's harder and harder to convince people that they want to keep their ranch and put it under conservation agreement, which means it's not getting developed ever, or selling at a reasonable price for acquisition to the federal government or the state government. That's really difficult when you can make a lot of money and really build wealth in your family by selling to a developer. So let's look back at those roads now. Roads are such a significant challenge for ocelot conservation because vehicular strikes are the leading known cause of ocelot mortality in Texas. Of the ocelots that we have their deaths documented, I think 70% of them happened on roads. We have a small cat, moves around at night, moves quickly, darts across open gaps to, go from one thorn forest patch to another. Unfortunately, this often brings them right across roads and in harm's way. We had a terrible year in, I want to say, 2017. We lost 7 ocelots in 1 year on roads right around the wildlife refuge. Remember, there are only 15 or 20 cats on the refuge. One more year like that, and we might have an extirpated population at the refuge. And so a number of this really terrible year, in some ways was awful. It really deeply impacted, I promised I wouldn't do that. It deeply impacted a number of us working in ocelot conservation, experienced that level of loss. At the same time, though, it did have some positive outcomes that I'm going to feature here in a bit. Now, just to highlight a few more unusual struggles that we have with ocelot conservation in this region. The first is oil and gas extraction, conveyance, and export. Basically, the Brownsville Ship Channel, where ships come in South Texas to load up with oil and gas, that one of those ports is right in the middle of ocelot habitat. Now, the part of it is already really well developed, and it's difficult to make any argument for restoration of ocelot habitat in that space. But as you head down this ship channel toward the Gulf of Mexico, we actually have a lot of really good ocelot habitat remaining. And this ship channel literally lines the bottom of Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge where the cats live. And so what we've been fighting for is no further development of the lands on the ship channel, that they infill and develop further into their footprint and not continue to sprawl. This is not going particularly well. We've lost a number of lawsuits, or one lawsuit in particular, and there have been other lawsuits brought as well to try to challenge the installation of liquid natural gas facilities. However, at the same time, Brownsville Ship Channel managers have been more open in recent years to understanding the plight of the ocelot and other wildlife in this region. And so now they have agreed to set some of the most important ocelot habitat and this landscape that also has really important features called lomas, which are ancient hills that happen to be covered in thorn forest. So they have set aside that land and are agreeing not to develop it. We'd like to see that agreement formalized a bit more. But again, victory is like in centimeters, and we're facing enormous challenges. This is not something any of my colleagues have to work on, well, except maybe in Florida. But the other challenge we've been facing is experimental rocketry. So SpaceX's experimental facility is located in Boca Chica in South Texas. It's private land that they're launching from, nestled amongst state beach, federal refuge land, and state parks. And so while it's launching off of private land, the impacts immediately spill over into public lands. We've had a number of wildfires set on National Wildlife Refuge land. We've had fiery debris rain down into state park land, and the landscapes around here are essentially incinerated. And what makes this really tough is the rockets they're launching here are not like the rockets at Cape Canaveral. This is an experimental facility. And so the rockets they are launching are the most powerful to ever leave this planet. There's only been one launch so far. It was back this spring. You may have seen some news about it. It got up into the air and then exploded. They're quickly building to their next launch, and we're really concerned about sound, vibration, fire, ejecting concrete and rebar and material off that launch pad that immediately spills over into the refuge lands. Now this is in the ocelots corridor in the area they occupy. I will say they're not right around here, but we have 9 other threatened and endangered species who use this site, including 5 species of sea turtle who use the beach directly adjacent, and piping plovers and red knots and Aplomado falcons. So this is an incredibly delicate site. It's a mix of mud flats, tidal flats, and thorn forest. This delicate site cannot bear this abuse over time. This is some of the impacts from the most recent launch. And then finally, another unusual, but not terrible, countries' borders are not an unusual thing. I would say what's unusual in this region right now is the vitriol around this boundary, this political boundary. And so I will say that the area that ocelots occupy, we actually do not have border wall right there. We have been able to advocate for other surveillance techniques. So we don't have a physical structure right there, which is really important because while we're thinking short term about connecting public and private lands cats, long term we'd love to build corridors back to Mexico. If the political boundary is fortified, it would be that much harder to defortify it. And so we fight to keep that boundary, that segment of the boundary, policed in other ways, in more remote ways. This is a little bit upriver. This is the private wall you may have heard about, the We Build the Wall wall. This is directly on the Rio Grande River. It's actually being undermined by the river right now. And it abuts the National Butterfly Center. You may have heard about some of that, those fights in the media. They were featured quite a bit. And so we have a really unique set of challenges on this landscape. We're monitoring a number of challenges, but also opportunities, right? We have to be creative. We have to think of ways forward for this cat, who again is still present on the landscape. It's not too late. And so there is really good work underway, and this is the hope part. So this is a juvenile male, and I'll just say their nickname in Spanish is Mani Gordo, fat hand, and you can see how big their paws are relative to their face. This was like one of the best days of my life. We captured this young male. They are captured humanely. This is part of the monitoring program at Laguna Atascosa. They take a lot of biological data on the cats, and then they're immediately released. There is really encouraging work being done in this field on the horizon. They are now extracting reproductive material from males when they, mature males. When they capture them like this, they're able to extract that reproductive material and bank it for conservation breeding. Talk about that more in a minute. At the same time, we have to think about restoration of thorn forest and reconnecting these cats through corridors. And so we have this map here. It's not a great map, but it's the one we got. All right, this is Laguna Atascosa in green. This is where our ocelots hang out. This up here, this is starting to get into the private ranch land. So this is our ranch land corridor and some more refuge complex land sort of built in there. What we want to do is build that yellow section. So we're reconnecting cats at Laguna Atascosa, right there on the coastline of Texas, up into private ranch lands. That's not a very big gap. It's 10 to 20 miles. It can be done. This is, again, about relationships with landowners, finding out what landowners want to do. Some want to sell. Some do not want to sell, understandably, but are open to some forms of conservation agreement. Now, conservation agreements can take many forms. They can be brokered by state agencies, federal agencies, nonprofits, or land trusts that are run by ranchers themselves. That last one tends to be the most popular model in South Texas. And so we have some really innovative work being done by, again, some of the most famous ranches in the country, and their leadership under groups like the East Foundation are bringing together ranchers into communities to think through a new ethic of land protection that includes thorn forest. And again, that gives us something to build to in between. So that there are many different aspects of landscape conservation that can help to reconnect these cats. This is what restoration of a thorn forest looks like when it's first planted. This is actually private ranch land that is monitored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we've got a number of replantings going on. Of course, rebuilding a biologically and ecologically complex forest system takes decades. And so the sooner we get this stuff in the ground, the better, right? Time is not on our side in many ways. And unfortunately, this sort of work takes time. Restoring forests, restoring cats takes time on the scale of decades at a time when we're experiencing so much development pressure. We're also thinking a lot more innovatively about how to provide these cats with safe passage. I mentioned that terrible year for ocelots. The good that came from that spike in ocelot mortality is that it got the attention of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Texas Department of Transportation, and it brought them to the table together because under the Endangered Species Act, something had to be done. We had an endangered species that was in crisis, and so a system of wildlife crossings went in at immense expense. I think they've spent I want to say each one goes from like $3 to $10 million to put in these very simple underpasses. This is a very flat landscape, and so unfortunately installing an underpass means having to really reconstruct the road and build up a hill so the animals have space to go under. Ocelots will not use a bridge. They will only use these structures under highways. What's really neat about this is the amount of expert opinion that goes into the siting of these. They consult a lot of observation data, the biologists who work on the ground, to pinpoint spots that would be most likely to be used by the cats. They then use a lot of fencing to help funnel the cats toward these sites. Mortality data is also unfortunately useful, that those deaths tell us where the cats were crossing. And a great deal of work has gone into the structures themselves. At one point, we were able to sort out that the cats would approach and refuse certain crossings if they were muddy. So in constructing concrete sidewalks in the crossing, cats would then get up on the concrete and walk past the mud. So we're observing these through a remote camera and tweaking design as we go, as we get real-time data in the receptivity of the specific species to this intervention on their landscape. These crossings went in 2020. The first year, we had no data of ocelots using them. Many other species on the landscape, alligators, bobcats, many other animals that live on this landscape were starting to use them, which is great on a number of levels. You know, it's protecting other endangered species or potentially endangered species, but it's also helping human safety. Hitting an alligator, they are not endangered, but hitting an alligator is actually very dangerous. They are very big, it causes a lot of damage, and it can result in harm to humans or even, you know, death. So again, getting these animals off the landscape or off the road and under improves the possible outcomes for humans and animals. We're also working in the social dimension. So one of the things we need to know a lot more about is what the community thinks about all of this. So for years, we knew that the landowners, of course, were very aware the cats were there. But it was sort of not a story that was being told in the local community in cities like Brownsville and Harlingen. And so one thing we've been getting together with these stakeholder groups to talk about is how to raise awareness for the presence of these cats and in turn impact human behavior in the community. There are a few targeted behaviors we'd like to change. One of them is the use of rodenticide. So ocelots will eat rodents, and of course if we are introducing poisons into the landscape by poisoning rodents in houses near ocelot occupied areas, we run a great risk of that poison entering the ecosystem. So we want to promote other options for managing rodent populations. Of course, the other thing is to raise awareness on roads so that drivers are paying attention and slowing down, which is an immense challenge because anyone who's driven a car knows you can sort of check out and not really be paying attention when you're driving. You might be moving a bit too fast, and then something happens right in front of you. Your response time might not be as good as it could be, and that can be a potentially bad outcome for an ocelot. So raising awareness, but impacting behavior in the longer term. And Anita and I have been talking about this a lot because it's really hard to think through how that is that you get that message in there, that people recall it each time they're on these roads that run through ocelot areas. We host community events now at the local zoo, Gladys Porter Zoo. They do have an ocelot on exhibit starting this year, which was also really important. These are very cryptic cats. You're not going to go to the refuge and see them. And so having a zoo-born ocelot on display, on exhibit at the zoo is really important for public outreach to literally put a face with the name. And then one thing that's really fun is people are really into these cats. This image of a cat using his crossing in 2020 went viral. Let's see, this was June 2020. We're all sitting at home. Board, and this image was released by Texas Department of Transportation and had millions and millions of views. And what's really cool there as a research scientist is the comments section. And so I'm starting to utilize some methodology from netnography to collect these comments and to examine what's being expressed in them. Preferences for the cats, strong feelings, a lot of enthusiasm for ocelots. They're not really a species of conflict. But what it shows us over and over is that people are like, I didn't know that cat was there, which tells us, first and foremost, we have a lot of work left to do to raise awareness for the presence of the cat. With that comes greater support for conservation efforts. Support takes many forms, including political as well as financial. This sighting was in February. This is very unusual. This ocelot, this is the main road at Laguna Atascosa. Those are speed bumps every couple of meters, really. We really try to control people's speed on the refuge. But this is a mother ocelot and her kitten, and this was a terrific moment again to communicate about their vulnerability, right? Like the vulnerability of these cats as they're crossing roads. And again, so I think the real hope here is in the public's reception to these cats, the enthusiasm, and at the same time, the shifting perspectives from landowners. Where this is a quote that came out from the East Foundation, which is again a collection of ranch landowners who are piloting innovative ideas for ocelot conservation on their lands, stating publicly, hey, normal ranching can take place with the presence of these cats. This matters so much that groups like this come out and say this. And I'll say the East Foundation has some really exciting stuff coming out. It's out for public comment right now. It's in the Federal Register. But they are looking at introducing some of the genetics that are being held in zoos at the moment in deep freeze, looking at finding ways to reintroduce that back into wild populations. And that will include conservation breeding and releasing newly born animals onto the landscape on private ranches. So not releasing animals into areas that are feeling a lot of development pressure, but rather bolstering populations on private lands where you have larger tracts of intact land. All right, so I'm going to take a sip of water and we're going to shift gears because the jaguar story actually ends up going in a hopeful direction. So when we left the jaguar, it was mid-20th century and it was done, right? Aldo Leopold, Ernest Thompson Seton, everyone's saying, they're gone. And indeed, there were no records of observations from the mid-1960s to the mid-1990s. And then in 1996, a crazy thing happened twice. Twice in 1 year, 2 different ranchers in 2 different states, one in New Mexico, one in Arizona, encountered a wild jaguar. And instead of pulling out their rifle, they pulled out their camera. Those moments were so impactful for the future of the jaguar in this region. Because both of these men, the way they were able to encounter these cats is because they were mountain lion hunting. So these hounds right here are trained to chase wild cats. Otherwise, they probably would have never even realized they were in the same area as these cats if they hadn't had these hounds with them. And so it was really fortuitous, again, because they opted not to kill the cat, but rather to celebrate its presence. And both men went very public with these sightings. This is Warner Glenn in New Mexico and Jack Childs in Arizona. Both have spent the rest of their lives being passionate advocates for the jaguar. And this ushered in a very interesting new era. This cat got left off the Endangered Species Act because we thought they were extirpated. So in 1997, 1 year later, they had to be added to the endangered species list because they were present. And since that time, we have enjoyed let's say a robust showing in that we have a really contiguous showing year after year. On average, we have 1 to 2 cats sighted in a year, all of them male. So we do not have evidence of a breeding population. But this is 2011, another hunter, his hounds ran a cat up a tree. This is 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. These are all remote camera, because at this point, okay, we know we got some cats, so we've gotten better and better with camera technology and our ability to sight those cameras, so we actually find these cats on the landscape. This record continues. As I mentioned, we had data announced last night. Every year, there's been at least 1 cat sighted on the landscape. In the last couple years, we've had 3 wild jaguars, all male. The one sighted most recently, we believe, is the newest of the batch. And these guys persist. They're living long lives. We have one who's really famous named El Jefe. El Jefe was popping, some of these are El Jefe, so he was more the early 2010s. He was sighted 100 miles away in Mexico 10 years later. And here's how we know for sure it's him. One of the greatest things about jaguars and ocelots are their spots. First of all, it makes them look super cool. But second of all, this is like a fingerprint. Once we have an image of both sides of a cat's body, we can identify them over and over again. And this is only enhanced and helped by AI, which is able to pick out some of these patterns. In the past, we would be lining up cat coat patterns and trying to match them, which can be tricky when you have cats at different angles. But yeah, we know who we're looking at once we have imagery from both sides. This is another recent cat. This is this was the most recent until, no, we've had 2 sighted since then. This is 2021. So these guys are hanging out, and again, that landscape might look surprising to you. The Sonoran Desert, especially along rivers and waterways, is incredibly verdant. It doesn't look like you might imagine. Often what people picture in their head as desert is really a Chihuahuan desert, which is much more arid and populated really by succulents. Now I have to mention the ocelot. So we also have an ocelot hanging out in this area. We think he uses the same corridors as the jaguar. So these jaguars, remember, they have like 100-mile ranges. And so we think they're moving across both sides of the border. That becomes really important, and I'll talk about that in a moment. This guy, his home range is probably 10 miles. So he might actually be living his entire life in Arizona. He might be using one of the corridors, but he's absolutely occupying areas that are also occupied by jaguars. And this is, we call him Lil Hefe. He got named after Big El Hefe. Unfortunately, again, we've never had evidence of a female on camera. Now that doesn't necessarily mean everything, because females use the landscape differently than males. And we are still learning so much about that from our monitoring in South Texas and elsewhere. So it might be we're just not positioning our cameras right. So we have a lot left to learn about ocelot lives in Arizona as well. So as I mentioned, we know the jaguars, at least one or two of them are crossing the border. We think all three are. This has become a very fraught issue in recent years, as we've seen fortification of the border. So we're talking about some of the most remote regions of Arizona and New Mexico. And in those regions, in the past, we had what we would call vehicle barriers. They would honestly sometimes just be like a wood post. It was enough to stop a vehicle, but wildlife could move right through these boundaries. With previous presidential administrations, of course, the border became, it ignited, right, in terms of public discourse and fortification. So we saw existing wall was rebuilt and made much taller. That didn't stop people from climbing them, by the way. And then we saw the creation of this very controversial structure where they took shipping crates and stacked them along the border. This had to be removed. And this was recently removed. And since that time, we've had that one cat sighted twice this year. We are pretty positive that cat was using this corridor through here and would not have been able to cross back into Arizona if the shipping containers were still there. And so now the great challenge on the border is finding ways to surveil these spaces in ways that the government deems necessary for the movement of, humans and other materials besides wildlife gets trafficked through here too, to be fair, but finding solutions to surveil the sites without creating physical impediments, which honestly do not stop people either. And so that remains a very hot topic of discourse, and we continue to advocate for ways that are wildlife friendly in this region. Jaguars also face a lot of threat from mining, and unfortunately it's copper mining, which results in highly toxic landscapes with giant pits. There is absolutely no coexisting between a mine and jaguars. This has been a very bitter fight in the court system for over a decade now. Unfortunately, I think the copper mines are prevailing at the moment, but it's continuing to play out through appeals courts. But this is game over. When you create pit mines like that, you've created a Superfund site, and the idea of restoring that then becomes on the scale of hundreds of years, and we don't have that kind of time, and we cannot afford to lose these kind of spaces for jaguars. So thinking about all of the impediments to jaguar movement in the border, a number of organizations got together, including Defenders of Wildlife and the Wildlife Conservation Society, to talk about other ways of fortifying jaguars on the Arizona and New Mexico landscape within their historic range. And so we had a number of meetings, collaborative meetings, where we invited all jaguar experts working in this area, modeling experts, habitat suitability assessment experts, tribal representatives from tribes in regions within historic range of jaguar and Arizona, who I'm not going to name by name intentionally, because some of them do not want to be named as participating in these processes at this time. These are all, and let's see, it wasn't an open stakeholder meeting yet. Rather, it was a meeting of groups invested in wildlife conservation and then land managers. We also had representatives from private lands communities to talk about the feasibility of jaguar reintroduction. And what we're really recognizing here is even if the boundary, the border wall, wasn't such a challenge, Interstate 10 is. So this highway runs from Texas through New Mexico and Arizona and into California. And it is a very large, significant highway, and it is acknowledged to be really the northernmost limit to the area that jaguars can recolonize on their own. Because jaguars don't want to overlap ranges, it's going to be a little more challenging than just creating a wildlife crossing or two. And again, we're talking about the scale of hundreds and hundreds of miles. And so natural recovery is likely not an option. So what do? We examined existing jaguar habitat models. In Arizona and New Mexico, we looked at, let's see, I think that 2, 4, 6, 12, yeah, it was 12 models, looking for agreement in habitat, vegetative cover, proximity to water, presence of prey species, a number of factors that govern the livability of the landscape for jaguars. And we found a high level of agreement. We then went and ground truthed throughout this region and found very high correlations that what the models were showing us is what we're able to observe on the landscape. And so we termed this area the Central Arizona, New Mexico Recovery Area. 80-something% of this area is public land, largely BLM. 12% is tribal land. And the rest is private land. The major city in this region is Flagstaff, and that is really the only city in this region. And again, this high correlation between models gave us a lot of encouragement that this was something to explore. So this is still very theoretical. And yeah, let's stay here. So now we've identified, okay, it's possible. The landscape is still there. It's federal land, which means we've got large swaths of land that could support jaguars. Our estimates based on the quality of habitat is it could actually support 50 to 150 jaguars in that region. That is significant. That, over time, if you built a population that size, that would be a significant boon for jaguar recovery. Remember, this is the very northernmost edge of jaguar habitation in the Americas, but that can be really important because we are facing unprecedented times in terms of climate change, right? And habitats are changing quickly. Well, a lot of this is higher elevation, so it's experiencing some of those changes differently. And some of the projected changes are suggesting that this might actually be a refuge for jaguars in the coming years. So this isn't just a fringe area to be discarded, but rather to be thought of as a refuge. We're also encouraged strongly by the shifting place of predators in the imagination of folks who live in the United States today. Time and again, research shows that people have overwhelmingly positive associations with these cats in modern times. Wolves are a little trickier. Wolves are a naughtier story. But there's a lot of public receptivity for these cats. So we're really encouraged by the data. Colorado State has done some phenomenal public survey work on the place of animals and predators. Now, of course, there are a lot of different communities encompassed in that recovery area I just showed. And one thing I want to emphasize is if the tribes don't want to go, we don't go. And that's why this is going to be decades long, because this is about relationship building with private landowners. This is about relationship building within federal agencies and building relationships with the tribes. Now, the tribes in this area have also been impacted by Mexican wolf reintroduction. And so we have to be very sensitive about that because it complicates this landscape. Also, the tribes are reporting that they don't have a lot of cultural memory of these cats. You know, there's some stories about cats, maybe some of them were spotted, but these aren't cats that are resonating and as holding a special place within those cultures. So maybe there's not as powerful an argument to be made for their restoration. And that matters. And so what comes next, now that we know the land is there, is listening and really listening. And again, that's the tough part, is this takes time. This takes time to build relationships, and it takes time to be comfortable in communicating. It also, we need to allow Mexican wolf to continue to play out a little longer, watch how that reintroduction's going, because it informs how we would think about this. Additionally, we also have to think about where the heck these jaguars are coming from. There aren't that many jaguars left in the world. We can't just take a whole bunch from another region and impact that population. So we also need to continue to monitor other programs that are dealing with highly endangered species and looking at how conservation breeding is going there. The Iberian lynx is an enormous success in Spain and Portugal. So all eyes are on that project. Same with Scottish wildcat. We've had some really, some smaller cats that have done really well in conservation breeding. Ocelot is going to be one of the next to go. Cheetah in a number of regions, including, you may have seen, India and I believe Iran, they might be starting to move toward conservation breeding. We've got a lot to learn. The bigger your cat is, the more delicate they are in interesting ways. But again, we've got to think on the scale of decades here, which is scary because I don't, at the same time, you do feel in your gut that maybe we don't have decades. It's a tight line to walk. One thing that we are experimented with, we published 3 papers sort of walking through this idea of the jaguar reintroduction. The third one talked about the social dimensions. And one thing that we threw out there, but I'm really interested in connecting with other scholars on, is this idea of reintroduction as justice. That is really a space that we need to think through a lot more, is framing restoration of species to their native places as part of justice for wildlife, justice for wild spaces. On that note, I have talked a very long time. I thank you all. I will answer any and all questions. I covered a lot of ground. I know there are probably some gaps there. I'm happy to answer any and all questions you have, but thank you so much again.
Sherry, thank you very much for the talk. In terms of environmental and conservation histories, how far back in time do you ever want to go? And in particular, do you want to go back before humans were in North America? Both of these cats have a fossil history.
They absolutely, yeah.
And they evolved in different continents. I think the ocelot evolved in North America, but the jaguar evolved in Eurasia.
Yeah.
Does that influence how you might talk about restoration? Because their histories go back very differently and to different different geographies too as well.
Thank you so much for that question. It's going to allow me to talk about something I started on and then did not get far enough down, which is this idea of restoration timelines and what we restore back to is of course so complicated. I know many of you are students of ecology, of biology, of history even. What do we restore back to? Our default through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service ends up being about 100 years ago. They will work back toward what we have that settler colonial record of, right? And that's actually kind of problematic in many ways. If we consider even a slightly longer history, if we acknowledge the incredible loss of life in the Americas due to disease, what we do theorize is that populations of wildlife might have been a bit higher than normal in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries because they were not experiencing the same pressures they had from human communities who were there before, who again were impacted by disease with the arrival of colonial presence. So there's a lot of debate on actually what these populations look like and what we need to restore back to. And then going even deeper in history, yeah, jaguars came across the land bridge and spread out throughout the Americas. I would say often when we're working like in applied conservation, working through the framework of fish and wildlife, we end up really locked in on some of these like greatest hits like Aldo Leopold that everybody kind of reaches back to. And I think some of that is because that's what they were taught in college, right? And it echoes forward. So I have a lot of hope this is going to change as we have more and more professionals thinking more broadly about time and space in terms of wildlife presence, entering the workforce and leading programs like this. But it's an enormous question. What is it we're trying to restore to? And whose presence are we acknowledging in terms of how they impacted wildlife populations of the past?
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering in terms of the like NASA Center, if you think that like over the years, if we like really document the conservation impacts it has on like all of those endangered species, if there's like even a sliver of hope for them moving that center or no?
It's a really good question, something we wrestle with daily. So I will point out that although SpaceX receives billions of dollars in funding from NASA, they are a private enterprise. And so this is commercial gain happening essentially on public land, which the Refuges Improvement Act actually really restricts. Any one of us is not supposed to be able to exploit refuge lands for personal gain. And from where we sit, we actually think that's what's happening here because of the ways in which the refuge is impacted by fire and literally flying rebar. But beyond that, it's really tough because this comes down to like interagency dynamics. You have NASA deeply invested. You have the FAA who's in charge of permitting launches. But they're under a lot of pressure because NASA has invested a lot of money here and they need this technology to go. At the same time, you have the Department of the Interior saying, hey, wait, this is impacting our land. And so our experience like inside the Beltway has been this is a very knotty problem. And I think the only way at this point to create pressure that would shift the location of this is like if permits stop being issued to launch. In the short term, that's how I'm seeing it. Longer term, if SpaceX wants to grow, they're really limited. They're bounded on all sides. So that site cannot just keep growing.
What would you say is the main draw for you to have joined the conservation field, considering the fact that it seems very despair-inducing?
Thank you for that question. It's funny, this was actually a topic of conversation at our lunch today. I met with students and we had lunch together. I think hope is actually what buoys many of us through this, as much as the challenges, especially in the space, are so enormous. At the same time, we have seen moments of incredible hope, like the reappearance of the jaguar. I mean, that was earth-shattering when these cats popped back up in the 1990s in our conservation communities. The fact that the ocelot is holding on, when I started 20 years ago, people were saying, these cats are done genetically, like this is a sink, they're over. They are surviving and sustaining. And so I think for many of us, it's important to have community amongst folks working on these issues, especially supporting and upholding people who work in really difficult aspects like the border wall. There is a great amount of human suffering interwoven into the story that is very difficult. Additionally, we work alongside the Carrizo Comecrudo in South Texas. That is a landless tribe. I take a lot of inspiration from fighting alongside them. The mouth of the Rio Grande, where it meets the Gulf of Mexico, is a sacred site. There are human remains present there. This is also exactly where they're launching rockets from. So I think there's something heartening about fighting the fight and not just letting these things go. And I think it's not for everyone because there are nights that are sleepless, but at the same time, a community within is really important. And like the jaguars, the ocelots, the oplomato falcons, the sea turtles, like there are some charismatic critters out there that kind of also give you that like mascot that you can also share with other people, that like kind of put a face to some of the challenges on the natural landscape.
Is it likely there are female jaguars out there and you're just not seeing them?
This is our favorite debate. unofficially, there are an awful lot of males around if there are no females. 3, it's possible she might live just south of the border, if there are females, because females do have smaller home ranges than males. When we sit around and talk about this, like around the campfire, we commonly tend to agree that they've got to be somewhere in the area. If we could just encourage them to step across the border, that would be great, because a breeding population then becomes a different thing in terms of how conservation is enacted within our federal systems.
Thank you. DNA seems to be a hot topic in conservation these days, and I'm curious, as you look back at some of these collections, like at the Smithsonian, the Natural History Museum, does DNA from those samples fill out your history, and especially the range, and connect it to the current population?
That's a really interesting question. I very briefly mentioned at the beginning that there was a jaguarundi death in Texas in the mid-1980s, and there's a lot of debate about that cat. And one thing we've been talking about is getting DNA work done on the remains of that cat that are in Chicago at the Natural History Museum, because that might help us to compare to, current populations to establish, was that a cat that was a pet maybe from South America, or was that a cat that is related, to the cats today? I'm not sure about going deeper into like the 19th century, how some of that DNA prevails, but I will say that there is still a great concern with like subspecies. For instance, when we're talking about reintroducing ocelots through genetic material and breeding, there is a lot of concern about that Tamaulipas population, about those being the cats woven back in. And within the genetics field, I read a lot of debate where other folks who work in genetics are like, get cats from South America, get them from wherever, it doesn't matter. Get diversity into that gene pool. And so it's a very interesting conversation happening at that level about restoration and like how, and I use this word intentionally and problematically because it is problematic, but how pure the genetics are in a specific population. And I actually think some of that purity language is in unacknowledged ways being used like from origins in like eugenics that folks are just not realizing. But that hyperfixation on purity can sometimes slow projects down.
I was just wondering, you were talking about like with the possibility of like a female jaguar and possibly being like just south of the border. So I was wondering if there were any groups or that you work with any groups in Mexico south of the border looking at the populations that they have there and where they are in proximity to the border and all that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we have a lot of great work being done just south of the border in Sonora, the Northern Jaguar Project. And there are a couple of other groups now that have formed agreements amongst landowners who are also working strategies in coexistence. Because these are cattle ranches, they do really experience some conflict with the jaguars taking cattle from time to time. And so that gets more into what you might have heard of as like traditional coexistence work, finding ways to scare the cats off from certain areas, just kind of push them off a little bit so that they're not considering domestic livestock as part of their prey base. A lot of this comes back to livestock management, like do you have people riding with the cats and the cows, guarding the cattle herds? Are you able to use things like flaggery, which is something that's used to deter wolves, flutters in the breeze and sort of scares wolves off? So these coexistence strategies are really the focus south of the border, where they have a healthy jaguar population. And a lot of the groups, including Defenders of Wildlife, I focus today north of the border, but really we work transboundary because it's the same group. It's the same group of cats, and in a lot of ways it's the same community, because the border, for folks who live here, it doesn't divide, it brings people together. This is the commonality of the culture of this region, is that we all live in the borderlands. And another thing we've done in the past is we like to recast the idea of these cats as renewable resources. So rather than a threat to your resources like cattle, it's like an incentive program where if a rancher allows cameras to be set up on their property, every time they get an image of a jaguar, they are paid like $100. And so the more times that jaguar or any jaguar pops up on camera, that's a renewable resource that pays again and again. And that's just one like easy example of ways of incentivizing the presence of cats.
Thank you. First, I had something that was reminding me, you probably know that in South America there are different stories of jaguars, so it was called my attention how you mentioned that tribes are not having that much memory of coexisting with cats, which is, yeah, surprising how in Buenos Aires, Guaranis and Muscovies, they have monuments for the jaguaretes to come back one day, like a lot of hope for the jaguarete one day to come back. Yet, there are many conflicts with conservation organizations who are trying to breed jaguaretes back. Collaborations are not succeeding, I guess,
Yes.
despite everyone willing the return of the jaguarete. Yeah, I don't know if you have any insights on that or not.
Yeah.
Just
So the name jaguar actually comes from the Guarani, the indigenous name for these cats in South America. And there are debates, but we think it meant something like a large beast that can kill in one leap. And what's really interesting about the historical memory of jaguars within tribes who have retained that connection, who can share these and are willing to share these stories, is that jaguars can occupy many planes, both physical and spiritual. So the jaguar might be in the forest, but the jaguar might also be a state that you enter as a warrior, or they might be a representative of ancestors or of gods. And it actually differs, of course, by region, by tribe, and through time. So it's really interesting looking at the different ways these cats shift through different perspectives and storytelling on these landscapes because they are so widely dispersed. They really cover an incredible diversity of human cultures. Of course, like if you think back to Mayan iconography, we often find like jaguars, right, are included in that iconography. So even where we might not have people who can share the stories anymore, we have lasting representations of these cats and their place in culture. It's yeah, like a really fun aspect to thinking about jaguars as, and thinking about their current conservation, because yeah, it is, even when everybody's on board and is like, yeah, these are really cool, we should definitely save them, the way in which that actually happens can be so complicated. I forget, there's one region now where you can actually go view jaguars. I'm trying to remember. They're right along the river, and they prey on crocodile a lot, and so they are just hanging out on the banks of the river. So now ecotourism is starting, and I cannot believe it's escaping my mind. It's a very famous region, but you can pay to go view jaguars safely from a boat. So it's an ethical form of wildlife viewing, and we have to think about ways, to help bolster conservation of cats. Economic incentives are really powerful incentives in conservation.
Well, all right. I think we are out of time, and just want to thank everybody for coming, and thank you very much, Sherry, for a wonderful talk and engaging Q&A. And thank you all for coming. We do have a lot of other events happening throughout the fall. If you haven't already signed up on our mailing list, please do. You can do that at our website, IIC, or it's wm.edu/conservation. You can also scan the QR code on the poster board, the sandwich board that's out in front of the building. So thank you all.
Thank you.